Okay, welcome back, class. We are going to go ahead and finish up Unit 2, Lesson 12 today. This was the only one we didn't quite finish in class during Unit 2. So we're going to start off with what limits the delegates' place on the national government. First of all, several of the rights protect political independence of political officials. For example, members cannot be arrested during attendance at session of their house. The reason they did this is so that nobody could feel like they were threatened for speaking their mind and have the threat of being arrested for saying what they truly believed in a session. Another is that Congress cannot impose religious tests to hold national office. That's in Article 6, Section 3. That way it ensured religious freedom in holding public office. Number 3, if members of the executive or judicial branches were accused of misconduct, they were subject to impeachment trials. And I believe in class we did talk about the two presidents that were impeached by the House of Representatives, President Bill Clinton and President Andrew Johnson. So we have had some judges impeached as well, none on the actual Supreme Court, however. And then number 4, the national government cannot take money from the Treasury without an appropriations bill. So this came into major controversy when passing the Affordable Care Act, and that piece of legislation actually began in the Senate, and it clearly states in the Constitution that appropriation bills must begin in the House of Representatives because it is a direct representation of the people. So if they're going to spend the people's money, they wanted to get permission from the people in order to spend that money. Number 5, the national government cannot grant titles of nobility. Therefore, we can't have a king of Indiana or a prince of Illinois. You don't have those titles granted because we didn't want a nobility here in America. We really believed in the idea of social mobility. All right, next slide. What limits the delegates' place on state government? So we did list a lot of limits on state governments so that we could function better as an entire nation. First, and importantly, is coining their own money. Therefore, we did have exchange rates between different states and have that confusing sense under the Articles of Confederation. Passing laws that enable people to violate contract. This goes back to that debate that we talked about between localists and cosmopolitists, where people living in the cities believed that everyone had to adhere to their contracts, and people living in the country that had to borrow money to survive during the Revolutionary War because the government never paid them their contract for being a soldier, they thought that they shouldn't have to pay back these cosmopolitists because, well, they didn't have the money to pay them back. Our founders believed that states should not be able to create laws that violate contracts, because that was one of the major things leading to Shays' Rebellion. And going back to the ideas of natural rights philosopher John Locke and your right to life, liberty, and property, most importantly. If you can violate a contract, that's violating somebody's right to property. Number 3, making ex post facto laws or bills of attainder. We've talked about both of those things before. Remember, ex post facto laws is making something illegal after the fact. And then bills of attainder would be a legislature dictating what a punishment could be without a proper judicial due process hearing for that individual. Number 4 through 6. 4 is entering into treaties or declaring war. Therefore, Indiana cannot declare war or enter into a treaty with Canada. Indiana can't enter a treaty to monopolize the maple syrup industry of Canada right here in Indiana. We also can't declare war on Canada just as an individual state. We can't, go in there and with our tanks while their Mounties are riding moose and drinking syrup out of the bottle. We can't do that here in Indiana. We also limited granting titles of nobility for the states and laying taxes on imports or exports. So we didn't want an individual state to be able to tax products coming from a foreign country or taxing products leaving their country. We wanted to leave that right up to our federal government. So here's a little picture of King Obama because we talked about granting titles of nobility. I just thought that was a funny picture online. Number 7, keeping troops or naval vessels during times of peace. So individual states could not keep troops during times of peace. And Article 6 also limits states in a few different ways. One being unfairly discriminating against citizens of another state. So this is the idea that you can't have, states discriminate against individuals from other states. That's why your driver's license is good in all 50 states. That's why your marriage license, when you guys eventually get married, will be good in all 50 states. You have to adhere to other states' processes and things like that. You cannot tax somebody extra if they move to your state or anything like that. You cannot discriminate against citizens of another state. Also, refusing to return fugitives from justice to the states from which they fled. It is the responsibility of a state where the criminal fled to bring that actual criminal back to the state. It is not the responsibility of the state where they actually committed a crime. So, for instance, if a bank robber from Indiana escapes to Michigan and they find him in Michigan, it is Michigan's responsibility to take that individual and bring them back to Indiana for their trial here in Indiana. Okay? Keep moving. How did slavery affect the distribution of national and state powers? Remember, slavery was one of those questions unanswered at the Constitutional Convention. And actually, the word slavery is never used. They refer to people in servitude or all other peoples. They never identify people directly as slavery. And they did that for a reason, because a lot of our founding fathers did have some moral conflicts with the idea of slavery and the philosophy behind slavery. Specifically, James Madison thought it would be wrong to list men as property in the Constitution. Some states believe that slavery should be solely a state issue. It shouldn't be addressed in the Constitution because it should be up to each individual state what they would like to do with slavery. Kind of like the Articles of Confederation, where the states had a lot of their own individual powers. They wanted a similar effect with slavery, not to have the federal government involved. So in addition to the Three-Fifths Compromise, another part of the Constitution that was added about slavery was Article 4, Section 2, called the Fugitive Slave Clause, saying that if a slave escaped to a state that banned slavery or escaped to a state where slavery was not permitted, it was against the law for those states, for citizens of those states, to house fugitive slaves. It was their responsibility to return those fugitive slaves back to the state where they should have been. Article 1, Section 9 also granted something to the northern delegates that they wanted, which was the discontinuation of the slave trade beginning in 1808. Now, the northern delegates really thought that the end of the slave trade would kind of, choke off slavery and end the idea of slavery by discontinue the importation of African slaves. However, what it actually did was just really boom the market domestically. They brought in so many slaves leading up to 1808. It became a market for breeding slaves and bringing slaves in to your own property. So if you could get slaves to be married and start having children, you could end up just having more slaves out of that. So it ended up being quite a problem. So it allowed the Southerners to increase the African slave population for 20 years, but it also discontinued the part of slavery most Northerners were appalled by, which was the process of essentially kidnapping Africans, bringing them in a brutal way over to the United States in a ship with very little sanitary or personal rights, and then forcing them to be slaves. So most of the Northerners were appalled most by the slave trade, not necessarily the practice of slavery itself. In fact, a lot of our founding fathers owned slaves themselves. So what issues did they leave unresolved at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia? First and foremost, slavery. Addressing slaves as 3/5 of a human being was not answering the question of whether this was going to be around for a long time. They did nothing about addressing the issue morally. They ended the slave trade in 1808, but that didn't end slavery as a whole, and they really did not address how the proportion of slavery would be dealt with in new territory. So they did have in the Northwest Ordinance that those people could not enter as slave states. However, slave states were not just going to let the northern free states have an advantage in the Senate and pass through legislation that would have been damaging to them. So that was one issue. Another is national citizenship. They never identify what it means to be a citizen. They say you have to be a natural-born citizen to be able to be the president. They never identify what it means to, be a citizen. They let individual states identify what it means to be a citizen, not something that they address at the convention intentionally because it's a controversial issue, because so many of our founding fathers were born in other areas of the world and not one of the original 13 states. So because of that, you had to address this concept that, well, is citizenship as important nationally as it is on a state-by-state issue? Next, voting rights they leave completely unaddressed. They do leave the time, places, and manners of elections up to the states. So essentially they lump voting rights into that as well. So obviously we talk a lot about how white landowning men get the right to vote immediately. We have to wait till the 19th Amendment for women to get that right to vote. We have to wait for the 14th and 15th Amendments to try and enforce black voting rights, but still Jim Crow laws in the South prevent blacks from voting in the South. Voting rights are still an issue today when we start discussing voter ID laws and things like that. So since the Constitution does not address voting rights, we've had a lot of conflicts with voting rights, and even some of our civil rights acts directed directly with the states trying to influence voting rights. Specifically, where did federal power end and state power begin? You have the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause. Those are other issues. But going back to, where federal power ends and state power begins, that's still in conflict today. You always have a struggle between states and the federal government to figure out where does power transition. The necessary and proper clause. Does that really give the central government the power to do whatever they want? And the supremacy clause in Article 6 saying that, any federal law is the supreme law of the land. Does that mean that the federal government can trump any state law and basically disregard states' rights? And the right of secession. If a state does believe that the government is becoming tyrannical, if the government is exceeding their powers, do they have the right to secede from the Union? And spoiler alert, this becomes a major issue later on when the South secedes from the North and a civil war ensues, okay? Declaring certain federal laws null and void. It does not address the issue. If an individual state, if they disagree with a law, can they identify that law as null and void and completely disregard the execution and enforcement of that law? So you see, this issue coming around today with controversial topics like abortion. Can an individual state say that the Supreme Court ruling of Roe v. Wade in the 1960s, can they declare that null and void? It's a federal kind of mandate that they give the states that they don't have the right to determine what they want to do with slavery within their own, or with abortion, within their own state. All right, and that's it for Lesson 12.